A powerful judge mocked a black teenager in court, convinced he was just another helpless defendant. But when the young man suddenly stood up, the entire courtroom fell silent. Who was really on trial that day? Have you ever witnessed a moment where the truth flipped everything upside down? Share your thoughts in the comments. Stick around. This story is about to take a shocking turn. Let's dive into what happened next. I had always believed in the justice system. I trusted the process, the laws, the idea that truth would always find a way to prevail. But today, sitting in this dimly lit courtroom, I felt something shift inside me. Something unsettling, something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, the system wasn't as fair as I had always believed. My name is Elliot Carter. I'm just an ordinary man, a husband, a father, a claims adjuster in the insurance business. I don't make waves. I follow the rules. And yet here I was, one of 12 jurors tasked with deciding the fate of a man who, from the moment he rolled into this courtroom, seemed to have already lost. Nathan Hale was a black man in his 40s, sitting motionless in a wheelchair, hands resting in his lap, his expression unreadable. The charges against him? Fraud. They said he had forged documents, stolen money from the government, manipulated the system for his own gain. I looked at him, trying to read something. Guilt, fear, remorse. But he gave nothing away. No trembling hands, no pleading eyes. Just silence. Watching. And then there was Judge Richard Vaughn. From the moment he stepped into the room, Vaughn radiated authority. A man who had spent years bending others to his will. He was tall, commanding, and sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that made you sit up straighter without realizing it. But there was something else too. Something cold, detached. Like he had already decided the verdict long before this trial had even begun. I felt it in the way he spoke to Nathan, like a man speaking to someone beneath him, someone whose fate had already been sealed. And then there was David Sinclair, the prosecutor, a man in a perfectly tailored suit. His voice was smooth, persuasive. Every word he spoke carried the weight of certainty. He laid out the evidence seamlessly, effortlessly, too effortlessly. There were no holes, no contradictions. It was as if the case had been prepackaged, wrapped up neatly with a bow, waiting to be signed, sealed, and delivered. I glanced at the other jurors. Some nodded along with Sinclair's words, their faces blank, resigned. Others fidgeted, casting uneasy glances around the room. But no one spoke. No one questioned anything. The air felt thick, heavy. It wasn't fear exactly. No one had threatened us. But there was an unspoken truth hanging over the room. This case was already decided. The jury was just here to play along. Nathan sat there listening, unmoving. Vaughn smirked at him from the bench, a glint of amusement in his eyes, as if daring him to fight back, knowing full well he couldn't win. I swallowed hard. Something about this didn't feel right. But in Vaughn's courtroom, what felt right didn't matter. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was here to deliver justice or just to witness an execution. David Sinclair stepped forward, adjusting his pristine cufflinks before addressing the jury. His every move was precise, deliberate, like a man who had already won. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth as silk, "the evidence speaks for itself." He gestured toward a neatly stacked pile of documents on the prosecution's table. They were pristine, no creases, no notes scribbled in the margins, no signs of rushed handling. Too perfect. He flipped open the top file and held up a set of financial records for the jury to see. "These are the falsified government aid forms," he declared, each one signed by the defendant, Nathan Hale, each one a lie. His words carried weight, sinking into the room like stones dropping into still water. A calculated pause followed, giving the jury time to absorb the alleged crime. I shifted in my seat. The numbers on the papers aligned too neatly. The transactions traced back to Nathan's name with an unnerving precision. No errors, no contradictions. Everything fit together too well. Real cases didn't work like that. There were always inconsistencies, messy details, small gaps, something that didn't quite add up. Investigations were never this spotless, but here, there wasn't a single loose thread to pull. Sinclair turned to Nathan, stepping closer, His eyes sharpened, his voice taking on a subtle edge. "Mr. Hale, do you deny that these documents bear your signature?" Nathan didn't flinch. "I don't deny that my name is on them." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Sinclair smiled, a small, triumphant smirk, sensing victory. "Then you admit to the fraud?" he pressed. Nathan exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. "I admit that someone wanted it to look that way." Silence. For the first time, Sinclair's confidence wavered, if only for a fraction of a second. Judge Vaughn, who had been observing like a king on his throne, leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Let me get this straight," Vaughn drawled, tapping a finger against his desk. "Are you saying that these official government documents with your signature, your fingerprints, were fabricated?" Nathan met his gaze without hesitation. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The room tensed. A few jurors exchanged glances. I felt my pulse quicken. I looked down at the stack of pristine files, at the flawless evidence, and suddenly a thought crept into my mind. A thought I hadn't dared to entertain before. What if he was telling the truth? And worse, what if we were all being played? Nathan's response had sent an uncomfortable ripple through the room. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't desperation. It was calm. The kind of calm that unsettled people because it meant one of two things. Either he was a master manipulator or he was telling the truth. The defense attorney, a wiry man in his 50s named James Holloway, seized the moment. He adjusted his glasses, stepping forward with renewed energy. "Your Honor, this raises serious concerns about the integrity of the evidence. If my client's signature was forged, we need to examine—" Bang! The sharp crack of Vaughn's gavel cut through the air like a gunshot. "That's enough," Vaughn barked, his voice firm, unwavering. "The evidence has been reviewed and verified. We're not here to chase conspiracy theories." Holloway hesitated, glancing toward Nathan before trying again. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we cannot ignore the possibility of—" Bang! Vaughn's grip on the gavel tightened, his eyes cold and sharp, locked onto Holloway like a predator warning off weaker prey. "This court will not entertain baseless accusations," he declared. "The prosecution's evidence is clear. We are not going to allow a known fraudster to manipulate the system." I felt a shift in my chest, an uncomfortable squeeze, like something inside me knew this wasn't right. Holloway opened his mouth, but Vaughn was already shaking his head, already dismissing him, already deciding what we should and shouldn't hear. This wasn't justice. This was control. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling as if the whole exchange had been an inconvenience. "Let's move on." And just like that, the door to the truth was slammed shut. I shifted in my seat, the weight of the moment pressing down on me, unsure of what would come next, but certain that something fundamental had changed. My fingers gripped the armrest of my seat just a little too tightly. The air in the courtroom felt heavier now, thick with something unspoken, something wrong. I wasn't the only one who felt it. I glanced at the other jurors, searching for some sign, some flicker of uncertainty, but they avoided my eyes, every single one of them. Some stared at the floor, others kept their focus locked on the prosecution's table, feigning interest in the neatly arranged stacks of evidence. A few stole quick glances at Judge Vaughn, as if seeking silent confirmation that they were doing exactly what was expected of them. Not a single person looked at Nathan. Not a single person acknowledged what we had just witnessed. I swallowed hard. I wanted to speak. I wanted to ask, isn't anyone else seeing this? Doesn't anyone else feel like something isn't right? But the words never left my mouth because I knew the truth, the unspoken rule in that courtroom. We weren't here to question, we were here to comply. Judge Vaughn had already decided. The case had been wrapped up before it even began. And if I spoke up, if I said the wrong thing, if I even hinted that I wasn't convinced, what then? Would Vaughn shut me down like he had with Holloway? Would I become a target, a problem that needed to be handled? Or worse, would I be dismissed? I felt it then. The quiet, suffocating pressure of power. Not the kind that shouted or threatened, but the kind that silenced, the kind that made ordinary people, people like me, too afraid to do what they knew was right. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay still, to say nothing. And in that moment I understood. We weren't here to decide anything. The verdict had already been written. We were just here to play along. The silence in the courtroom had weight, thick, pressing, suffocating. All eyes were on Nathan Hale. He sat there unmoving, unshaken, his hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair. There was no desperation in his eyes, no frantic pleas for mercy. He wasn't afraid. And then, in a voice as steady as stone, he spoke, "I am not guilty. Those documents were fabricated." The words hung in the air, untouched, unwavering. A few people in the gallery scoffed, a low murmur spreading through the room. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone shift in their chair. But the most chilling reaction wasn't from the spectators. It was from Judge Vaughn. He didn't frown. He didn't slam his gavel in outrage. He smiled. It was small, just a slight upward twitch of the lips, a smirk filled with something close to amusement. Not surprise, not anger, just amusement, like a cat watching a mouse struggle before the inevitable. Slowly, Vaughn leaned forward, resting his elbow on the bench. His fingers tapped against the polished wood, measured and patient, as if he were indulging a child in a harmless fantasy. "Fabricated," he repeated, drawing the word out like he was tasting it. He let out a low chuckle and shook his head. "That's an interesting choice of words, Mr. Hale." His voice was smooth, rich with mockery. "So, let me get this straight," Vaughn continued, gesturing lazily toward the neat stack of documents on the prosecution's table. "You're telling this court that these official records, documents bearing your name, your information, your signature, were somehow planted?" He turned to the jury, eyebrows raised in mock curiosity, as if waiting for one of us to laugh along with him. No one did. Nathan held his gaze, unblinking. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying." Another ripple of whispers filled the room. I saw Sinclair shift slightly, adjusting his tie. Vaughn, however, just exhaled through his nose, shaking his head like a teacher disappointed in a foolish student. "Mr. Hale," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "do you really think you can outsmart the system? That you, of all people, can manipulate the justice process and walk away?" A pause followed, a pause that shouldn't have mattered but did, because in that moment, it was clear Vaughn didn't see a man sitting before him. He saw a problem that needed to be eliminated. And as Nathan sat there, unshaken in the face of it all, I realized something. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting something much bigger. Judge Vaughn exhaled slowly, as if savoring the moment. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the polished wood of his bench, his expression unreadable. Not solemn, not conflicted, just inevitable. Then he looked up, scanning the room. His gaze lingered on the jury just long enough to remind us of our place. He already knew how this would end. We all did. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as he leaned forward, his voice steady, unshaken. "Nathan Hale, I find you guilty." The words landed like a hammer, yet they carried no weight for Vaughn. No hesitation, no burden, just another case closed. A hush fell over the room. No gas, no murmurs, just silence. Cold, suffocating, final. And yet, despite knowing this was coming, despite understanding from the very start that this verdict had been decided long before any of us stepped foot in this courtroom, it still hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt my stomach tighten, a sharp, unbearable pressure building in my chest. It was as if something inside me had snapped, yet there was no sound, no visible break, just the crushing weight of injustice settling into place. I gripped the edge of my seat, knuckles white, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to move, to speak, to do something, but I didn't. Because what difference would it make? The trial was never real. The verdict had been written before the first witness had spoken, before the first piece of evidence had been presented. Nathan was always meant to lose, and yet as I looked at him, I saw no fear, no anger, no despair. He just sat there, waiting, like he knew something none of us did. The silence that followed Vaughn's verdict was suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, a steady drum against my ribs, deafening in the absolute stillness of the courtroom. No one spoke. No one moved. Not the jurors, not the spectators, not Nathan. And then, a sound, a slow, deliberate creak. I turned toward it, my breath hitching. The wheels of Nathan's chair groaned against the polished floor, the rubber scraping softly as he adjusted his position. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, just a slight shift, like he was readjusting himself. But then he pushed against the armrests. His hands, firm and steady, gripped the edges of his chair. And then Nathan Hale stood up, not wobbly, not struggling. He rose with quiet strength, unfolding himself from the seat like a man who had never belonged there in the first place. For a moment, no one reacted because it was impossible, because he wasn't supposed to be able to stand. A sharp gasp echoed from the gallery. Someone in the back dropped a pen. I heard a choked sound from one of the jurors across the room. Sinclair's mouth hung open, his carefully rehearsed certainty crumbling. He blinked rapidly, as if his mind couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. But Vaughn was the one who snapped backward. His hands, once lazily draped over his desk, suddenly clutched the wooden bench as if bracing for impact. His breath hitched, his chest rising in a sharp, startled gasp. For the first time, he looked afraid. Nathan's stand had changed everything. Nathan's gaze met Vaughn's, unflinching, steady, and in that instant, the balance of power in the room shifted. Nathan stood tall. The room froze. Every eye in the courtroom locked on him. Disbelief thick in the air. No one moved. No one breathed. No one understood what was happening. Then in one smooth motion, Nathan reached into his pocket. For a split second, no one reacted. The shock of seeing him on his feet had stolen every ounce of logic from the room. But as his hand emerged, gripping something small and metallic, I saw Vaughn's fingers twitch toward his gavel, as if he still believed he could silence this. He couldn't. Nathan flipped open the badge in his hand. Nathan Hale, Special Agent, United States Department of Justice. The silence shattered. A pen clattered onto the table as one of the jurors fumbled, his fingers trembling. The woman beside him sucked in a sharp breath, her face pale as if all the blood had drained from it. Sinclair took a step back. Just one, but it was enough. The smooth, confident prosecutor was unraveling. Vaughn, however, didn't move. His expression remained unreadable for a moment longer, as if his brain were struggling to catch up with reality, as if he could will this moment into not existing. Nathan took a step forward, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. I've been investigating you for months, Vaughn. The judge's jaw clenched, his knuckles turning white against the bench. Nathan's eyes didn't waver. How many innocent people have you condemned? How many times have you sold verdicts to the highest bidder? No one dared to speak. Vaughn didn't answer, but the color had drained from his face, his smirk long gone. Sinclair, now visibly shaken, took another step back, his shoulders stiff, his fingers twitching at his side as if calculating an escape route. But there was nowhere left to run. In that moment, the entire courtroom shifted. Nathan was no longer the defendant. Vaughn was no longer the judge. And for the first time, the man who had ruled this courtroom with unchecked power found himself standing in the shadow of something much greater than himself. For a moment, time stood still. The weight of Nathan's revelation suffocated the room, pressing against our chests like a force we couldn't see but couldn't ignore. Then, bam! The courtroom doors slammed open, crashing against the walls with a thunderous force. A dozen federal agents poured in, their movements swift, precise, unstoppable. The room erupted into chaos. Spectators gasped, jurors twisted in their seats. A woman in the gallery let out a strangled cry. The air was electric, a storm of tension waiting to break. And at the center of it all was Vaughn. The moment the doors flew open, he bolted upright, his hands gripping the bench as if it could anchor him to the power that was slipping through his fingers. No! His voice cracked, raw with panic. His head snapped toward Nathan, toward the agents, toward the walls closing in around him. This is my courtroom. I am the law. His voice, once a weapon, now sounded desperate, hollow. Sinclair, the ever-confident prosecutor, took an instinctive step back, his hands trembling at his sides. He knew what was coming. Vaughn, however, fought. He lurched forward, his hands outstretched as if reaching for something, anything to stop what was happening. But there was nothing left to hold on to. Two agents grabbed him, yanking his arms behind his back. Click. The cuffs locked around his wrists, cold and final. The room held its breath. Vaughn thrashed, his face twisted in fury, in disbelief. "You can't do this! I am a judge!" But the gavel was no longer in his hands. His word no longer mattered. And as the agents pulled him away, the man who had once decided the fate of so many found himself powerless against his own. For the first time since stepping into this courtroom, I could finally breathe. The weight pressing against my chest, the suffocating grip of fear, it was gone. I hadn't realized how much tension I'd been carrying, how deeply I'd been holding my breath, until now. Slowly, I glanced at the other jurors. For so long, we had been prisoners of Vaughn's authority, too afraid to question, too afraid to even acknowledge what we all knew was wrong. But now the spell had broken. They looked at each other, hesitant at first, as if afraid to believe it was real. And then something shifted. Shoulders relaxed, eyes met. For the first time, we were no longer bound by fear. A whisper, barely audible, broke the silence. "It's over. The monster is gone." The words rippled through the air, carrying with them the weight of everything we had endured. The injustice, the silence, the powerlessness. And as I looked around the courtroom, I realized something else. This place no longer felt like a cage. Not anymore. As I stepped out of the courthouse, the crisp afternoon air hit me like a wave. Fresh, unfiltered, untainted. But I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest. Nathan Hale had won today. Justice for once had prevailed. But I couldn't stop thinking about how many others hadn't been so lucky. How many times had men like Vaughn sat in a courtroom just like this one, silencing the innocent, twisting the law to serve their own greed? How many names had been buried beneath false verdicts, lost in the cracks of a broken system? The thought made my stomach turn. For years I had believed in the law, in the idea that truth always found its way to the surface. But today I had seen the truth for what it really was: fragile, constantly at war with corruption, and always in need of someone willing to fight for it. Nathan hadn't just defended himself today. He had exposed a lie. He had stood when no one else could. And as I walked away from that courtroom, I knew I could never be silent again. Because justice doesn't just happen. It takes people willing to fight for it, even when it's dangerous, even when it's easier to look away, even when the whole world is telling you to stay quiet. Nathan had shown me that. He had shown all of us. The system wasn't unbreakable. The powerful weren't untouchable. And the truth, though fragile, could still win if someone had the courage to stand for it. That's what lingered with me as I left. The realization that silence wasn't neutrality, it was complicity. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's keep these conversations going. The world doesn't change when we stay quiet. It changes when we speak, when we act, when we refuse to let the Vaughns of the world win. And if you believe in the power of truth and justice, hit that like button. Let it be a small signal, a quiet stand, a reminder that we're not alone in wanting something better. Because today I learned that justice isn't a gift handed down from above. It's a battle,